Robert Miller was 68 years old, the kind of man who carried the quiet pride of a life once built on discipline and movement. For over 3 decades, he had worked as a high school physical education teacher in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. His job had kept him strong on his feet from dawn till late afternoon, teaching teenagers the basics of basketball, baseball, and the importance of warming up before a sprint. Retirement had slowed his days but hadn't erased the instincts of a man who had always been active. Every morning just after sunrise, Robert laced up his sneakers, pulled on a faded Ohio State hoodie, and walked the same 2-mile loop around his neighborhood. He liked the rhythm of the walk, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, the rustle of leaves when the breeze slipped through the maple trees that lined the cul-de-sac. It reminded him that even though the years were piling on, he was still part of the world's steady pulse. But lately, Robert felt the weight of age in ways that unsettled him. His legs still carried him forward, but the spring in his step was gone. He noticed it when he had to pause halfway up the front porch steps, catching his breath with a hand on the railing, something he never used to do. He noticed it when his granddaughter, Emily, handed him a baseball and begged him to throw a few pitches in the backyard. He managed only 10 throws before his shoulder ached and his energy drained, leaving him embarrassed when Emily tilted her head and said, "Grandpa, are you tired already?" He had laughed it off, patting her hair and making a joke about being rusty, but the truth sat heavy inside him. For a man who once outran half his students during gym class, being winded by a game of catch was a quiet reminder that time was no longer on his side. Robert wasn't one to complain. His wife Linda often teased that he could be bleeding from the head and still say he was fine. That stubborn streak had carried him through life, but now it kept him silent about the small humiliations he was experiencing. He didn't tell Linda how some mornings he woke up without the energy to tackle even the simplest tasks. He didn't admit that at night, lying in bed, he sometimes felt restless and disconnected, unable to sleep as soundly as he once did. And he certainly didn't mention the nagging fear that the man he used to be, the strong, confident, steady Robert Miller, was slipping away with every year that passed. Still, in public, he kept up appearances. When neighbors waved from their porches, he lifted his hand and smiled, pretending nothing had changed. When old colleagues from the high school asked how retirement was treating him, he said all the right things. "It's great. More time with the grandkids, more time to relax." Inside, though, he wrestled with a creeping anxiety that no one else could see. It wasn't just about losing his strength, it was about losing a piece of himself. For a man whose identity had always been tied to movement and energy, the quiet decline felt like a thief sneaking into his life, one step at a time. And so, that morning in early October, as Robert finished his walk and returned home with the sound of dry leaves crunching under his sneakers, he felt a mix of gratitude and unease. Gratitude that he could still do it, unease that it wasn't getting any easier. He pushed open the front door, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen where Linda was humming along to an old country song on the radio. He smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and poured himself a cup, the warmth of the mug steady in his hand. To anyone looking in, it was the picture of an ordinary morning in an ordinary American home. But inside Robert's mind, a quiet question lingered like an echo he couldn't shake. How much longer could he keep pretending everything was fine? As the weeks rolled by, Robert began to notice small changes that no amount of stubbornness could hide. They crept into his life quietly, not with a single dramatic moment, but through a series of little reminders that his body wasn't keeping pace with his spirit. The first came on a chilly Saturday morning when he decided to rake the backyard. It used to be a task he could finish in under an hour, the rhythmic scrape of the rake almost soothing, but that day his back stiffened after just 15 minutes. He paused, leaned on the handle, and glanced toward the porch where Linda was sipping coffee. She waved, and he forced a smile, determined not to show that his lower back felt as though someone had slipped a weight into his spine. Another reminder came at night. Sleep had once been his refuge, deep and steady, but now it betrayed him. He often woke around 2 in the morning, tossing under the quilt, his mind restless while his body refused to settle. He'd get up, pad quietly to the kitchen in his slippers, and pour a glass of water just to feel like he was doing something. The refrigerator's hum seemed louder in the stillness, and he'd stand there, staring at family photos pinned to the door, wondering if his students would even recognize the man he was becoming. The most humiliating change, though, showed itself in his energy. Robert had always prided himself on being the kind of grandfather who could keep up with his grandkids, but lately he struggled. One afternoon, Emily wanted to race him down the sidewalk. He laughed, crouched into a runner's stance, and pushed off the pavement with more confidence than sense. 10 seconds later, his chest burned, his breath came in short bursts, and Emily, giggling, had already crossed the imaginary finish line. He waved her on, joking that she'd better start training for the Olympics, but inside his pride stung. He hated that his granddaughter's laughter carried a reminder he couldn't ignore. He was slowing down. Linda noticed too, though she didn't say it outright. Instead, she fussed gently, placing a hand on his arm and telling him to rest more often. Once, when he sat down heavily in his recliner after a short walk, she reached over and gave his hand a squeeze. "You're still my strong man," she said softly. Robert appreciated her words, but he couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe she was trying to reassure herself as much as him. The changes weren't just physical. They gnawed at his confidence. When he looked in the mirror, he saw the same familiar features, his square jaw, his weathered skin, his gray hair under the ball cap, but behind his eyes was a question he couldn't answer. Was this just normal aging, or was he on the edge of something worse? He didn't talk about it, not even with Linda. Admitting it out loud would make it real, and Robert wasn't ready for that. Instead, he carried the worry quietly, like a stone in his pocket, always there, always weighing him down. And yet, beneath the frustration, there was still a flicker of determination. Robert had spent his life teaching young people to push through discomfort, to train their bodies to stay disciplined. Now, as he sat in his recliner listening to the distant sound of children playing on the street, he wondered if he could take his own advice. The aches and fatigue were real, but so was his desire not to surrender. What he didn't know was that soon, an unexpected conversation would point him toward a solution he never would have considered on his own. Robert had never been the type to run to the doctor for every little ache, but Linda had a way of persuading him when it mattered. That fall, after watching him slow down more than usual, she finally insisted he book his annual checkup. "It's just routine," she said with a smile that told him she wasn't taking no for an answer. So one Tuesday morning, he found himself sitting on the crinkly paper of an exam table at Dr. Whitaker's office, the same clinic he had visited for more than 20 years. The walls hadn't changed much, still lined with faded posters about heart health and flu shots, but Robert felt different in the chair, more patient than teacher now, more vulnerable than he liked to admit. Dr. Whitaker was a kind man in his early 50s, sharp but approachable, with a habit of explaining things slowly, as though he knew his patients preferred plain talk over medical jargon. After the usual blood pressure check, reflex tap, and a long list of questions about diet and sleep, he sat across from Robert with a small folder in his hand. "Your numbers are mostly where they should be," he said, pausing just long enough for Robert to relax before adding, "but there's one thing we need to talk about. Your testosterone levels are lower than what we'd like to see for a man your age." Robert shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. He had read enough magazine articles to know what that meant: low energy, muscle loss, mood swings, even issues no man wanted to talk about out loud. "So what does that mean for me?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Dr. Whitaker leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It explains the fatigue you've been feeling and maybe even the trouble sleeping. It's common, Robert, happens to most men as they get older. But it doesn't mean you have to accept it as the end of the line." He outlined the typical options: medications, hormone replacement therapies, before adding something that surprised Robert. "There are also natural changes you can make, dietary shifts that can help support your body. Sometimes the simplest adjustments can make a big difference." Robert smirked, half amused, half doubtful. "You're telling me a salad is going to fix me?" Dr. Whitaker chuckled. "Not exactly, but certain foods have properties that support testosterone and overall vitality. I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but combined with good sleep and exercise, it can help more than you'd think." He rattled off a few examples, and Robert listened politely, though part of him wanted to dismiss the idea as wishful thinking. For most of his life, food had been fuel, not medicine. Still, something about the doctor's steady tone stuck with him. As he left the office, lab results tucked in a small envelope, Robert felt a swirl of emotions. Relief that nothing more serious had shown up, frustration that he wasn't the man he used to be, and curiosity about whether small changes could really make such a difference. Walking out into the crisp October air, he adjusted his cap and pulled his jacket tighter. Across the street, a younger man jogged past, earbuds in, barely breaking a sweat. Robert watched him for a moment, a quiet determination rising in his chest. If there was a way to reclaim even a piece of the strength he once had, he owed it to himself and to his family to try. What he didn't realize was that the real clue to that path wasn't going to come from the doctor at all, but from a simple conversation with someone much closer to home. A week after his doctor's visit, Robert was outside on a crisp Saturday morning, sweeping the last of the golden leaves from his driveway. The air carried that unmistakable scent of late autumn, wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace mixed with the faint tang of damp earth. His breath puffed in little clouds as he leaned on the broom, shoulders aching more than he cared to admit. Across the street, his neighbor Jim Callahan was unloading groceries from the back of his pickup. Jim was about Robert's age, a retired firefighter with a frame that still looked solid, the kind of man who carried himself like he'd never truly left the job. "Morning, Bob," Jim called, hefting a brown paper bag under one arm. "You look like you could use a break." Robert chuckled and waved the broom. "Yeah, well, the leaves don't rake themselves." Jim grinned, setting the bag on his porch before strolling over. "Tell me about it." "But I'll tell you something, I don't feel half as sore as I used to. Been trying something new." Robert raised an eyebrow, amused. "What's that? Miracle pills? Yoga? Don't tell me you're into goat yoga now, Jim." Jim laughed, shaking his head. "No goats involved, I promise. It's food, or rather one food, avocados." Robert blinked. "Avocados, you're kidding." "Not at all," Jim said, crossing his arms. "Started eating half an avocado every morning about a year ago. On toast, in a smoothie, sometimes just straight with a little salt and pepper. I swear, Bob, it's made a difference. More energy, better sleep. Even my doctor said my numbers are looking up. Testosterone, prostate health, all of it." Robert smirked, unconvinced. "You're telling me a green fruit fixed all that? Come on, Jim, you used to run into burning buildings for a living. Maybe you're just tougher than the rest of us." Jim shook his head, smiling. "Trust me, I'm no tougher than you. Look, I thought it sounded silly too, but then I tried it. And when I kept at it, I realized I wasn't dragging through the day anymore, felt steadier. My wife even noticed." Robert leaned on his broom, frowning thoughtfully. He remembered Dr. Whitaker mentioning diet, but he hadn't taken it seriously. Hearing it from Jim, though someone who had walked the same path of aches, fatigue, and pride, it landed differently. "Avocados, huh?" Robert muttered, almost to himself. "Yep," Jim said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You can get a bag of them down at Kroger. Just pick the ones that give a little when you press them. Too hard and they're not ready, too soft and they're no good. Find the sweet spot, slice it open, and you'll see what I mean." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought the secret to feeling younger would be sitting in the produce aisle." Jim grinned. "Life's full of surprises, my friend. Sometimes it's not about the big changes, just the small ones you actually stick with." As Jim headed back across the street, Robert looked down at his broom, then over at his neighbor's porch where the brown paper bags still sat. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of curiosity. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a miracle, but maybe, just maybe, there was something to what Jim had said. He made a mental note to stop by the store later. The thought of bringing home avocados made him feel a little ridiculous, but the idea of reclaiming even a piece of the man he used to be was enough to push aside his pride. That Monday afternoon, Robert found himself pushing a shopping cart through the produce section of the local Kroger. He felt a little sheepish, as if he were sneaking around on some secret mission. Standing in front of the avocado display, he remembered Jim's advice. Press them gently, find the sweet spot. Easier said than done, Robert thought. He picked one up, pressed it with his thumb, frowned, and put it back. He repeated the process with 3 more, muttering under his breath. Finally, a young woman in yoga pants glanced at him, smiled politely, and said, "If you want to make guacamole tonight, go for the softer ones. If you're planning ahead, pick the firmer ones." Robert chuckled awkwardly. "Thanks, I'm new to this avocado business." When he got home, Linda raised an eyebrow at the bag in his hand. "What's this?" "You finally decided to try guacamole." Robert cleared his throat. "Just thought I'd give something new a shot. Heard these things are good for you." The next morning, he stood in the kitchen staring at the green fruit on the counter like it was some kind of puzzle. He sliced it in half, twisting the knife clumsily until the pit popped out. The creamy flesh looked promising, though his first attempt at scooping it out left chunks scattered across the cutting board. He mashed it with a fork, spread it unevenly on a slice of toast, and took a cautious bite. To his surprise, it wasn't bad, rich, buttery, with just enough flavor to make plain toast feel like something more. Feeling encouraged, he decided to try a smoothie the following day. He tossed half an avocado into the blender with milk, a banana, and a scoop of protein powder he'd found in the back of the pantry. The machine whirred loudly, then groaned as the mixture thickened into a pale green sludge. Robert poured it into a glass, stared at the heavy consistency, and muttered, "Looks like I made myself a cup of wet cement." When Linda walked in, she burst out laughing. "Are you planning to drink that or patch the driveway?" Robert grinned sheepishly but took a sip anyway. The texture was questionable, but the taste wasn't bad. "Not terrible," he admitted, though his expression gave him away. By the end of the week, avocado had become part of his morning routine. Some days it was toast, other days he sliced it over scrambled eggs. Slowly, the clumsiness faded, replaced by a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the fruit, it was about proving to himself that he could adapt, that he wasn't stuck in the decline he feared. One evening, as he tossed the peel and pit into the trash, Linda wrapped her arms around his waist. You know, she said softly, I've noticed you've had a little more spring in your step lately. You don't seem as worn out in the evenings. Robert chuckled, brushing it off. Maybe it's the avocados. Or maybe it's just me trying to keep up with you. But inside, he felt a flicker of pride. For the first time in a long while, he believed that small changes might really make a difference. As he rinsed the cutting board and set it against the sink, he realized he was actually looking forward to the mornings now. Not because he expected miracles, but because he'd found something simple he could control. For a man who had spent weeks feeling like his body was slipping away, that sense of control was worth more than he could put into words. At first, Robert didn't notice much. The avocado toast and the occasional smoothie felt more like an experiment than a solution. But after a couple of weeks, small differences began to creep into his days, the kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention. One morning, he realized he hadn't hit the snooze button on his alarm. He'd woken up before the chime, rested, with enough energy to lace up his sneakers and head out for his walk without dragging his feet. The cool November air bit at his cheeks, but instead of feeling drained halfway through, he returned home with a steadier stride and even enough breath left to carry on a full conversation with Linda as she sipped her coffee. The changes showed up in other ways too. Nights that used to be restless now seemed smoother. He still woke occasionally, but not with the same heavy restlessness that drove him to wander the house in silence. Instead, he could roll over, adjust the quilt, and drift back into sleep. It wasn't perfect, but it was better enough to make mornings feel less like a chore. Energy found its way back into his afternoons as well. He no longer collapsed into his recliner after raking leaves or carrying groceries. One Saturday, Emily bounded into the living room, baseball glove in hand, and asked if he wanted to play catch in the backyard. Robert hesitated, worried about repeating the embarrassment from weeks before, but he followed her out anyway. To his surprise, after 15, then 20 throws, he was still standing tall. His arm ached a little, but his chest wasn't burning and his breath came steady. Emily grinned, her ponytail bouncing as she ran after the ball. "You're getting better, Grandpa," she shouted. Robert smiled, his pride swelling in a way he hadn't felt in months. Linda noticed too. She teased him one evening when he got up from the couch without groaning. "Well, look at you," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Who needs a new recliner when you're moving like you're 20 years younger?" Robert rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his grin. He felt lighter not just in body but in spirit, and that confidence bled into the smallest corners of his life. It wasn't just about the physical strength. He caught himself humming while working in the garage, something he hadn't done in years. He lingered outside longer during his walks, enjoying the snap of cold air and the crunch of frost under his sneakers. And perhaps most surprising of all, he didn't dread his next checkup. For once, he looked forward to stepping on the scale and answering the doctor's questions with something other than half-truths. Robert knew better than to think a single fruit had turned him into Superman. He was realistic. Age still lived in his joints, and his hair was as gray as ever. But the improvements felt undeniable, like a hand had lifted some of the weight he'd been carrying. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was on a steady decline. Instead, he felt like he'd found a way to push back, even if just a little. That night, as he stood at the kitchen counter slicing another avocado, Robert paused for a moment, holding the green flesh in his hand. He thought of Jim's words, "Sometimes it's not about the big changes, just the small ones you actually stick with." He smiled to himself, realizing how true that was. He wasn't chasing miracles anymore. He was simply taking small steps toward feeling like himself again, and for a man who thought those days were behind him, that was no small victory. Thanksgiving arrived with the usual buzz of family filling the Miller household. The kitchen bustled with the scent of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, and Linda's famous pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. Robert had always loved these gatherings, but in recent years he'd felt more like an observer than a participant, sinking into his recliner while the younger ones carried the weight of the day. This year, however, was different. Emily burst through the back door, her cheeks pink from the November chill, holding a football nearly half her size. "Grandpa, come outside, we're starting a game," she shouted. Robert hesitated, glancing at Linda, who was busy mashing potatoes. She caught his eye, tilted her head toward the door, and gave him a little smile that said, "Go on." Pulling on his jacket, Robert stepped outside where his sons, daughters-in-law, and a gaggle of grandkids were already dividing into teams on the lawn. The grass was patchy and the ground cold, but the kids didn't seem to notice. Emily handed him the ball, her grin wide with expectation. "You're on my team," she declared. At first, Robert moved cautiously, worried his knees might protest or that his breath would give out too soon. But as the game picked up, something shifted. He found himself jogging, then running, surprising even himself when he managed to intercept a pass and jog the ball back down the yard to a chorus of cheers. Emily threw her arms around him. "You're awesome, Grandpa," she said, her laughter ringing in the crisp air. Robert's chest swelled, not with exhaustion this time, but with a joy he hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and the house had quieted, Linda put on an old record in the living room. The warm crackle of vinyl filled the air as a familiar tune drifted out, one they had danced to decades ago at their wedding. She reached for Robert's hand, her eyes twinkling. "Dance with me," she whispered. He chuckled, shaking his head at first. "It's been a long day, you'll have to settle for a slow shuffle." "Perfect," she replied, tugging him gently toward the center of the room. With the grandkids peeking from the stairs and muffled giggles drifting down, Robert wrapped his arms around Linda and began to sway. His knees didn't buckle, his breath didn't falter, and in that moment time seemed to fold in on itself. They weren't grandparents in their 60s and 70s. They were young again, moving together in rhythm, the weight of the years forgotten. When the song ended, Linda leaned her head against his shoulder. "You seem different lately," she murmured, stronger. Happier, Robert didn't answer right away. He simply held her, grateful for the quiet strength in her words. Inside, though, he knew she was right. He wasn't cured of aging, no one could be, but he had found a way to reclaim pieces of himself that he thought were lost. And it wasn't about vanity or pride anymore. It was about being present, about giving his family the version of himself that still had something left to give. As the grandkids finally tumbled into the living room, clapping and teasing them about their old-timey dance moves, Robert laughed louder than he had in a long time. The fatigue that once weighed on his shoulders had lifted, replaced by a sense of belonging and vitality that no medicine bottle had ever given him. And all it had taken was a small green fruit and the willingness to believe that change, however unlikely, was still possible. The following week, Robert found himself sitting with Jim on the porch after church, both men wrapped in heavy jackets against the December chill. They sipped coffee from travel mugs while their wives chatted inside. Jim leaned back in his chair and gave Robert a knowing smile. "So you've joined the avocado club, huh?" Robert chuckled. "Yeah, I guess I have. Didn't think I'd ever get excited about a piece of produce, but here we are." Jim laughed. "Funny how something so simple can make a difference." Robert nodded, thoughtful. "I'll admit I was skeptical, but lately I've been sleeping better, feeling sharper. Even Linda noticed. I can't explain it, though." "What's in those things that makes them work?" Jim shrugged. "I'm no doctor, but I did some reading. They're loaded with vitamin E, which protects your cells from damage. That alone helps with energy. Then there's potassium, more than bananas, actually keeps your blood pressure in check. And magnesium, good for your bones and muscles, makes sense for guys like us." Robert listened, intrigued. He had spent most of his career telling teenagers to stretch before running and drink water after gym class, but he'd never thought much about nutrients beyond the basics. "Linda said my doctor mentioned diet changes too," he admitted. "Guess I should have paid more attention." Jim leaned in a little. "Here's the part that got me. Avocados have something called beta-sitosterol. Sounds fancy, but it's basically a plant compound that helps balance testosterone and supports the prostate. Helps with urinary flow too. My doc said men our age can really benefit from it." I figured it was worth a shot. Robert raised his eyebrows. "So you're telling me this little fruit is doing what expensive pills are supposed to?" Jim grinned. "Well, maybe not replacing everything, but it's a natural boost. No side effects, no prescriptions, just nature doing what it does best." Robert sat back, considering this. It made sense in a way that was almost too simple. No wonder his body felt steadier. It wasn't just in his head. There was real science behind the changes. And the best part, it didn't feel like work. He wasn't choking down pills or forcing himself into some extreme routine. He was just eating breakfast, something he'd done every day of his life, only now with a little green upgrade. Later that night, when Linda asked how his day had been, Robert found himself explaining what Jim had told him. She listened with interest, smiling as she dried the dinner dishes. "See," she said, "I told you food could be more than just fuel." Robert laughed. "Guess you were right, don't let it go to your head." But privately he felt a deep sense of relief. For weeks he'd worried that his decline was unstoppable, that he was helpless against the slow march of age. Now he understood that while he couldn't turn back the clock, he could tip the balance in his favor. It wasn't about pretending he was 30 again. It was about giving his body the support it needed to keep moving, to keep living, to keep being the man he wanted to be for Linda, for his kids, and for Emily. As he rinsed his mug and set it on the counter, Robert smiled at the thought. Avocados weren't magic, but they were proof that small, deliberate choices could ripple into big changes. For a man who had always taught others about discipline and persistence, it felt good to relearn the lesson himself. A few nights later, Robert sat alone in the living room after everyone had gone to bed. The only light came from the lamp beside his recliner, casting a warm glow on the framed photos lined up across the mantel. Pictures of his kids as teenagers, Emily's gap-toothed smile, Linda and him on their wedding day, all silent reminders of the years that had passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. He leaned back, hands folded over his stomach, and let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He thought about the man he used to be, the coach who could outrun his students during practice drills, the dad who tossed his sons high into the air without breaking a sweat, the husband who could dance with Linda for hours at county fairs. That man had seemed untouchable once, strong and steady as oak, and yet here he was, realizing how fragile strength really was. Aging hadn't come all at once, it had crept in quietly, disguised as stiff knees, restless nights, and shortness of breath. He had ignored it at first, then tried to laugh it off, but the truth was it scared him. Now, with a few simple changes, nothing more than a fruit on his plate each morning, he felt like he had wrestled back a piece of control. Not a miracle, not a cure, but a reminder that his story wasn't finished yet. He smiled to himself, remembering Jim's words, "It's not about the big changes, just the small ones you actually stick with." How true that felt now. Robert shifted in his chair and glanced down at his hands. They were rougher than they used to be, the skin looser, the veins more pronounced. But tonight, instead of seeing only age, he saw evidence of a life lived fully, a life of work, play, love, and resilience. The aches and gray hair were part of the deal, but they didn't have to define him. What mattered was how he responded. And lately, he'd chosen to respond by showing up, by trying, by refusing to surrender quietly to decline. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Emily padded into the room in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Grandpa, why are you still up?" she asked sleepily. Robert smiled and opened his arms. She climbed into his lap, curling against him as naturally as she had when she was a toddler. "Just thinking," he said softly, kissing the top of her head. "About what?" He hesitated, then chuckled. "About how sometimes little things can make a big difference, like eating the right food or playing catch in the yard, or even just sitting here with you." Emily yawned, content, and soon her breathing slowed as she drifted back to sleep against his chest. Robert held her a little tighter, feeling the steady rise and fall of her small frame. In that moment, all the worries that had weighed on him seemed to fade. What mattered wasn't chasing youth or denying age, it was having the strength to be present for the people who mattered most. When Linda appeared in the doorway to gently guide Emily back to bed, Robert caught her eye and smiled. He didn't need to say anything, she already understood. Sometimes the quiet victories spoke loudest. As the house settled into silence once more, Robert turned off the lamp and headed upstairs. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, not because everything was fixed, but because he had found a way forward. And that, he realized, was enough. Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline of Robert's house, casting a soft glow on the snow-dusted yard as family gathered inside for another holiday meal. The living room was alive with laughter, children darting between adults, Linda's voice calling everyone to the table, and the faint sound of carols playing from the old radio on the counter. Robert stood by the window for a moment, taking it all in, the warmth of the room wrapping around him like a blanket. He thought about how different things had felt only a few months ago, how heavy his body had seemed, how uncertain his steps, how much he had feared losing pieces of himself he could never get back. Now, though, he felt something else, presence, energy, and gratitude. Not the kind of energy he once had in his 20s, but the kind that mattered more now, the strength to throw a football in the yard, to share a dance with his wife, to carry his granddaughter up the stairs when she fell asleep in his arms. He had not beaten time, but he had learned to walk alongside it with a little more grace. And it all started with something so small he had once laughed it off, a piece of fruit on his breakfast plate. He knew better than to believe in miracles, but he also knew the difference between giving up and fighting back, and he chose to fight back in the quiet ways that added up to something real. As he sat at the table, carving slices of turkey and listening to the conversation flow around him, Robert cleared his throat and spoke up. "You know, getting older isn't easy. It sneaks up on you, makes you feel like you're losing more than you're gaining. But I've learned something this year. Sometimes the smallest change can give you back more than you expected. I didn't find a cure, I didn't turn the clock back, but I did find a way to feel like myself again. And if an old guy like me can do it, anyone can." His words were met with a quiet pause, then smiles and nods from his family, even a cheer from Emily, who lifted her glass of apple cider and declared, "To Grandpa." Robert laughed, raising his own glass. In that moment, he wasn't just sharing advice, he was offering a piece of hope, a reminder that aging didn't have to mean surrender. And though he would never call himself a storyteller, he felt that maybe others needed to hear it too. So if you're listening now, if you've made it to this part of his story, remember this. Take the small steps, try the simple changes, and don't be afraid to believe they can matter. And if you found something in Robert's journey that speaks to you, share it with someone else, give it a like, and subscribe so more people can find a reason to keep fighting for their health and happiness. Because in the end, it's not just about years added to your life, but life added to your years, and that, Robert realized, was the real victory.